Happy Wednesday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Market Update, where we discuss leading financial and economic developments in Europe, Asia, and North America. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. And first up, on Tuesday, US President Donald Trump intensified his protectionist push, announcing a 50% tariff on copper imports and hinting at a crippling 200% levy on foreign-made pharmaceuticals, although the latter may come with a grace period of up to 18 months for companies to onshore production. Speaking during a cabinet meeting, Trump confirmed plans to move forward with tariffs across several strategic sectors, including semiconductors, metals, and pharmaceuticals. Copper futures in New York responded immediately, surging as much as 17%. That was the largest single-day price surge since records began going back to 1968, with the price reaching all-time highs. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick later told CNBC that the administration's investigation into copper under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act was complete, and the tariff would likely be implemented by the 1st of August. He emphasized the administration's belief that foreign copper imports pose a national security risk, similar to earlier arguments during the president's first term when it came to tariffs on steel and aluminium. While the move is seen as a win for domestic copper miners, it could disrupt long-standing trade flows. The US relies on imports for roughly 36% of its refined copper consumption, with major suppliers including Chile, Canada, and Mexico. Supporters of the president's move would argue that this is exactly why tariffs need to be erected to bring such an important commodity back home. With global demand for copper expected to surge amid the green energy transition, any disruption could have knock-on effects for industries from EV production to data centers. Trump also turned his attention to the pharmaceutical industry, proposing a 200% tariff on imported drugs, but offering manufacturers a grace period to relocate production to the US. The S&P 500 index of drug makers turned negative following the comments. The pharmaceutical sector, heavily reliant on offshore production, particularly in Ireland, has warned that such tariffs could strain supply chains and raise costs for consumers. Nonetheless, Trump reiterated his stance that offshore drug manufacturing represents a national security risk and said companies would be given a year or more to shift operations before facing penalties. Once again, one of the lessons from the pandemic was that it can be a national security vulnerability if many of your key drugs come from overseas, especially from a rival country. Of course, at that time, many drugs came from China. Now, despite all the tariff noise, US equity markets remained relatively stable. Copper stocks rallied, while drug makers were volatile. Wall Street analysts said the renewed trade rhetoric was unlikely to derail broader market momentum, pointing to resilient corporate earnings and expectations of Federal Reserve cuts later this year. Next up, the European Union is considering a sweeping €100 billion, $117 billion US dollar financial package to support Ukraine as its war with Russia drags into its fourth year with no resolution in sight. According to officials familiar with the discussions, speaking to several media outlets, including the US-based Bloomberg and US-based Politico, the proposed fund would be included in the EU's next 7-year budget, expected to be unveiled on the 16th of July. If approved by member states, disbursements would begin in 2028, ensuring a steady pipeline of aid to Ukraine even if US support diminishes. So far, the EU has pledged nearly €160 billion to Ukraine, including a €50 billion package of grants and loans that runs through 2027. Additionally, the bloc and the Group of Seven, G7, established a $50 billion US dollar loan fund using interest income from frozen Russian central bank assets. The new financing proposal would extend the support through 2034, potentially tying future payments to Ukraine's progress on EU accession-related reforms. European Commission officials have not commented on the specifics of the new budget proposal, but have emphasized the need for continued support. In June, the Commission told EU finance ministers that Ukraine's financial needs should be covered through early 2027, warning of a potential budget gap driven by ongoing conflict and reduced external aid. EU Economy Commissioner Dombrovskis confirmed on yesterday, that multiple funding options are being evaluated, including the use of proceeds from immobilized Russian sovereign assets. He reiterated the EU's commitment to providing, quote, all necessary support for Ukraine as long as it is needed, end quote. If you want to be on top of the most up-to-date analysis on the big developments shaping our world today, consider subscribing to Market Update, hit the bell notification icon, and you will be. And if you're getting some value from today's episode of Market Update, don't forget to hit the like button. It's just 2 clicks of the mouse, but it's a tremendous help for an independent creator like myself. So if you want these updates and want to see independent media give legacy media a run for its money, these 2 clicks are a big help. Next up, Southeast Asia is bracing for economic headwinds after US President Donald Trump announced steep reciprocal tariffs on goods from 6 ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nation, member states, marking the latest escalation in Washington's trade confrontation with countries it accuses of unfair practices and complicity in Chinese transshipment. The new duties, set to take effect on the 1st of August, range from 25% to 40%, hitting Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Only Vietnam, which struck a deal with Washington, has seen a reduced rate of 20%, although transshipped goods face a 40% levy. Trump's announcement, which we covered in greater detail in yesterday's video, has cast a shadow over regional trade and diplomacy. Governments across ASEAN have scrambled to negotiate exemptions or reductions, often offering to increase imports of American goods. However, these efforts have yielded limited results so far. Washington's focus on transshipment, a practice where Chinese goods are rerouted through Southeast Asian countries to avoid US tariffs, has put the region in the crosshairs of America's intensifying trade war with China. Analysts warn that economies such as Indonesia and Thailand, reliant on low-cost manufacturing and integrated supply chains, are especially vulnerable. Quote, "The risk of being targeted with transshipment-related tariffs is high," end quote, said Deborah Elms of the Henrich Foundation, warning that firms may begin shifting away from US-dependent supply models. For countries like Indonesia, the impact could be significant. One analyst at Indonesia's Center of Economic and Law Studies estimates that a 32% tariff could slash economic output by over $10 billion, affecting labor-intensive industries still reliant on American demand. Meanwhile, Malaysia's government signaled its intent to continue talks in good faith, stating that, quote, "constructive engagement," end quote, was the only viable path forward. The region's exposure to both US and Chinese economic gravity leaves ASEAN members walking a fine line. As China warns of retaliation against countries aligning with US tariff policies, macroeconomist Priyanka Kishore notes that, quote, "Southeast Asia's industrial output, deeply tied to Chinese inputs, could take a hit if geopolitical frictions deepen," end quote. With foreign ministers from ASEAN, the US, and other key nations set to meet in Kuala Lumpur this week, trade tensions are expected to dominate discussions. Trump's tariffs, along with regional instability in Myanmar and maritime disputes in the South China Sea, form a complex diplomatic backdrop. The draft communique of ASEAN's internal meetings reflects, quote, "concern over rising global trade tensions," end quote, and calls unilateral tariffs a threat to regional stability. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's participation, his first visit to Asia in this role, is seen as a litmus test for Washington's commitment to the region. Rubio is expected to stress America's support for a, quote, "free and open Indo-Pacific," end quote, but analysts like Hafidis Razali of Strategic Council warn that ASEAN must not be treated as a mere geopolitical pawn, expressing, quote, "ASEAN is not a backdoor to China. It has its own identity and strategic goals," end quote. Complicating matters, ASEAN faces internal divisions. The bloc remains paralyzed over the civil conflict in Myanmar and is now dealing with a diplomatic spat between Thailand and Cambodia following the suspension of Thailand's prime minister. While Malaysia, the current ASEAN chair, has advocated a humanitarian approach to Myanmar's crisis, political solutions remain elusive. With just weeks before the tariffs kick in, governments across ASEAN are racing against the clock to avoid a trade shock. But with the US president's unpredictable negotiating style and growing global instability, the path to a stable outcome remains uncertain. Okay, that is today's episode of Market Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Wednesday, and I will see you for another update tomorrow.